What if an army decided to abandon its own headquarters not because it lost a battle, but because it no longer believed those walls would still be standing by morning? Tonight, soldiers of the Islamic Republic's regular army are walking away from their bases across central and western Iran. They are disappearing into the dark, leaving behind command centers, barracks, and supply depots that have served as the backbone of their military structure for decades. As they scatter, American strikes are already falling on a town most of the world has never heard of, built for one purpose: nuclear. This is not a small development. It marks a turning point in a campaign that has, until now, mostly focused on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite force that answers directly to Iran's clerical leadership. The regular army, known as the Artyzh, has largely stayed in the background of this conflict. But something has changed. Intelligence reaching Tehran now suggests that American forces are preparing to expand their target list beyond the Guard and to strike the conventional military as well. For the soldiers inside those bases, the choice was stark: stay and risk being caught inside a structure that could be hit at any moment, or leave and hope that scattering into the countryside offers a better chance of survival. Many are expected to simply return home. Others may hide in the open, in the desert, without shelter, without a clear chain of command above them. This is where the real damage begins to show. An army is not just made up of soldiers. It is built on structured command centers, supply lines, a place where officers can gather, plan, and issue orders. Without bases, none of that can function. Even if every single soldier survives the night, the army as an organized fighting force starts to fall apart. Analysts watching this unfold point to a deeper problem inside Iran's military system. The regular army and the Revolutionary Guard do not fully trust each other. The Guard maintains its own network of secret facilities, underground bunkers, and hardened shelters built specifically for its own forces. These sites are rarely open to the regular army, even in moments of crisis. That means the soldiers now fleeing their bases cannot simply move into Guard-controlled bunkers for protection. They are, in a very real sense, on their own. This distrust becomes especially important if the conflict were ever to move toward a ground element. Military planners understand that controlling territory requires more than air power. At some point, someone has to hold the ground. For Iran, that job would normally fall to the army, supported by its bases, its equipment depots, and its command network. If those bases are lost, evacuated, or destroyed, the ability to organize any real ground response becomes far more difficult. Soldiers without bases cannot easily be resupplied, repositioned, or commanded in a coordinated way. That is why military observers describe tonight's evacuation as more than a tactical retreat. It is being read as a structural blow to the coherence of Iran's armed forces. A government can replace lost equipment. It can even replace lost soldiers over time. But rebuilding trust between rival branches of the military and re-establishing a functioning command structure under continued pressure is a much slower and much harder process. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. When soldiers are told to abandon their own headquarters, the message that sends both to the troops themselves and to the wider police is one of vulnerability. It suggests that even the government's own institutions no longer feel confident in their ability to protect their people. In a country already dealing with economic strain and public frustration, this kind of visible retreat can quietly erode morale in ways that are hard to reverse. For now, the immediate picture is one of soldiers dispersing into the dark, away from the buildings that once gave their army structure and purpose. What replaces that structure, if anything, remains uncertain. What is clear is that this evacuation did not happen in isolation. It came as part of a wider escalation, one that has already begun reaching far beyond army bases and into the heart of Iran's most sensitive nuclear infrastructure. The evacuation of army bases marked a shift in strategy. What happened next marked a shift in scale. Overnight, the campaign widened far beyond anything seen in earlier phases of this conflict. Strikes reached the southern coastline, port cities, and interior regions that had until now remained largely untouched. Areas once considered too far from the front line to matter suddenly found themselves under direct attack. Much of this expansion has been made possible by something quieter than the strikes themselves: a change in regional posture. For years, several Gulf states publicly insisted they would never allow their territory to be used as a launching point against Iran, even after fighting broke out. That position held, at least in public statements. That has now changed. Several of these same states are quietly permitting direct military access from their soil a development that carries weight far beyond the individual strikes it enables. This matters because it signals something about how the region now views the conflict. Countries that once feared retaliation from Tehran enough to keep their distance are now willing to accept that risk. It suggests a growing confidence or perhaps growing desperation that the balance of power in the region has shifted. For Iran, it also removes any illusion that neighboring states might remain neutral bystanders. The map of who is involved, directly or indirectly, has quietly grown larger. Alongside this expansion in geography came an expansion in the type of targets being struck. Among the most significant developments was a confirmed strike on a town whose entire purpose centers on Iran's nuclear program. This is not a major city, and it holds no real strategic value beyond one thing: it exists to support a nuclear facility. Its location, its infrastructure, its rule were all built around that single function. The targeting of a site like this represents a clear escalation. Earlier phases of the campaign focused primarily on military hardware, missile launchers, drone platforms, radar systems, and vessels believed to be involved in attacks on international shipping. Later strikes expanded to naval bases and air defense systems. Nuclear-linked infrastructure, however, sits in a different category altogether. It is tied not just to Iran's military capability, but to a program that has shaped years of international diplomacy, sanctions, actions, and negotiation. Striking it changes the nature of the conversation surrounding this conflict, moving it from a regional military dispute into something with far broader implications. None of this appears to be happening in isolation. Analysts tracking the pattern of strikes describe a campaign that has moved in stages, each one slightly broader than the last. What began as targeted action against specific military assets has steadily expanded to include infrastructure, air defenses, and now sites tied directly to the nuclear program, rather than a single dramatic escalation. This looks more like a deliberate, incremental widening of the target list, each stage building on the one before it. Taken together, these developments paint a picture of a campaign that is no longer confined by earlier boundaries, geographic or otherwise. States that once refused involvement now quietly assisted. Targets once considered off limits are now being struck directly. And the story is expanding, not just in terms of physical destruction, but in terms of what it will ultimately mean for the region's balance of power. What remains to be understood is the human cost behind these strikes and how the deaths of specific individuals connected to the regime are already beginning to shape the next phase of this crisis. Behind every strike location on a map, there is a name, a rank, and a chain of command that either holds together or breaks apart. Overnight, one of those names became part of the story. A senior security official was confirmed killed at a facility linked to specialized military operations. Independent reporting reached this conclusion well before Iran's own state media acknowledged a pattern that has repeated itself throughout this conflict. Confirmations from official channels inside Iran often arrive hours, sometimes days, after the facts are already known elsewhere. This delay is not accidental. It reflects a government that appears increasingly cautious about what it reveals to its own population and when. Announcing the death of a senior official immediately risks feeding a narrative of vulnerability at a moment when the leadership is already struggling to project strength. So the confirmation waits. Even as the loss itself has already reshaped the operational picture on the ground, the loss of a senior official is rarely just about one person. Positions like this typically carry institutional knowledge, operational authority, and a network of relationships that cannot simply be transferred to a replacement overnight. Each time a figure like this is removed, the organization around them absorbs a small but real amount of disruption, even if that disruption is never publicly acknowledged. At the same time, Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement directed not at the United States, but at neighboring Gulf states. The message warned these countries against allowing their territory to be used against Iran, framing their cooperation with American forces as a decision they would come to regret. On its surface, this reads as a standard diplomatic warning. Examined more closely, it reveals a strategic contradiction. Iran is simultaneously under direct attack from the United States and issuing threats to smaller neighboring states, some of which have far less capacity to defend themselves than Iran does. Threatening multiple fronts while already struggling to manage one raises questions about whether this reflects strength, or the appearance of strength masking a weaker underlying position. This tension becomes even clearer when placed alongside a separate, ongoing threat: reported efforts to target the President of the United States. According to recent intelligence assessments, an attempt was reportedly planned during the president's travel abroad, only to be discovered and neutralized before it could be carried out. This is not the first such episode. Over the past several years, multiple plots aimed at American leadership have been reported, each one ultimately failing before reaching execution. The significance of these attempts lies less in whether any single one succeeds, and more in what their persistence reveals. A credible threat against a sitting head of state is treated with extreme seriousness by any government, regardless of whether the plot is ultimately stopped. Each failed attempt still forces a response in the form of heightened security, adjusted travel plans, and increased scrutiny of intelligence networks. In that sense, even an unsuccessful plot extracts a crust, shaping decisions long after the immediate danger is past. Some observers argue that these episodes should be viewed with caution, suggesting they may be exaggerated for political effect. Others maintain that the documented pattern spanning multiple years and multiple separate incidents is difficult to dismiss as coincidence or exaggeration alone. What is clear is that this thread does not exist in isolation. It runs alongside battlefield losses, contradictory diplomatic messaging, and a leadership structure that appears more focused on projecting resolve than addressing the underlying strain building beneath it. Taken together, the confirmed death of a senior official, the contradictory warnings issued to neighboring states, and the recurring reports of assassination planning point to a regime attempting to manage crises on several fronts at once. Each of these threads may appear separate on the surface, but together they begin to suggest a leadership structure under mounting pressure, one that is being tested not only by external strikes but by its own ability to respond to that pressure in a coherent way. That question of coherence and what it reveals about who is truly in control inside Iran right now is where this analysis turns next, as the strikes continue and the losses accumulate. A deeper question has begun to surface, one that matters more than any single strike or statement. It is no longer only about what Iran's military can withstand. It is about who, if anyone, is actually in charge of the country's response. At the center of this question is the continued absence of Iran's supreme leader from any verifiable public appearance. For an extended period now, no independently confirmed audio or video of him has emerged. Written statements have continued to be released under his name, but the individual behind them has not been seen or heard directly. His absence has fueled ongoing speculation among analysts and observers about his health, his whereabouts, and whether the statements attributed to him are being issued with his direct involvement at all. No claim here is being made as fact. What can be said with confidence is that the silence itself has become part of the story, feeding uncertainty at the exact moment Iran's leadership most needs to project stability. That uncertainty deepens further when attention turns to who else claims to speak for the regime. Multiple figures now appear to be asserting authority in parallel, rather than through any single clear chain of command. Leadership within the Revolutionary Guard continues to project control over military decision-making. Parliamentary figures, including the Speaker of Parliament, appear to hold more practical influence over government affairs than the President himself, whose public role has become increasingly marginal. And clerical authority, normally still resting with the Supreme Leader, remains clouded by his continued absence from view. This is not simply a matter of competing personalities. When multiple centers of power operate without one clearly dominant authority, decision-making slows, contradicts itself, and becomes harder to coordinate under pressure. In a moment defined by active military strikes, evacuated bases, and diplomatic threats being issued on multiple fronts, this kind of fragmented leadership structure becomes a genuine liability. A government that cannot present a single coherent voice struggles to negotiate, struggles to reassure its own population, and struggles to respond quickly when circumstances shift. This fragmentation also helps explain a noticeable shift in Iran's tactical behavior compared to earlier phases of this broader conflict. In previous rounds, Iran's primary response relied heavily on direct missile and drone strikes, including attacks aimed at Israel itself. This time, the pattern looks different. The regime has instead leaned on lower cost, lower risk options such as attempts to restrict shipping through the Strait of Hormuz while notably avoiding direct strikes on Israel altogether. Iran has also avoided targeting Saudi Arabia this time, despite having done so in earlier phases of the conflict. The shift is unlikely to reflect a change in strategy born from strength. It more closely resembles a change born from caution or constraint. A regime confident in its position does not typically narrow its list of targets or avoid its most capable adversaries. Analysts point to this behavioral shift as one of the clearest indicators, yet that Iran's leadership understands its own weakened position, even if it continues to publicly project defiance. Taken together, these signals point toward a regime under significant internal strain, not only from external military pressure, but from its own inability to present a unified, confident response. The absence of visible leadership at the top, the presence of multiple competing centers of authority beneath it, and a visible shift toward more cautious, defensive tactics all point in the same direction. What comes next remains uncertain. Continued military pressure appears aimed less at physically destroying Iran's remaining infrastructure and more at accelerating the process already underway, the slow erosion of a leadership structure struggling to hold itself together. Whether that pressure leads to a negotiated de-escalation, a further deepening of internal fracture, or something else entirely is not yet clear. What is clear is that the events of the past several days, the evacuation of army bases, the expansion of strikes into nuclear-linked infrastructure, the confirmed loss of senior officials, and the mounting evidence of leadership fragmentation together represent more than an isolated military escalation. They represent a moment in which the internal cohesion of the Iranian regime is being tested as directly as its military capabilities. How that test concludes may ultimately matter more than any single strike carried out along the way. Because what we are witnessing is not just a military campaign. It is the slow, quiet unraveling of a system that has spent decades building layers of redundancy, secrecy, and coercion to protect itself. Those layers are being peeled back one base evacuation, one unexplained explosion, one absent leader at a time. The soldiers who walked away from their headquarters tonight may have saved their own lives. But they also walked away from the institutional structure that made them soldiers in the first place. And once that structure is gone, once the command networks, the supply depots, the trusted relationships between officers and troops are broken, it cannot be rebuilt by simply issuing new orders. It takes years, sometimes decades. And Iran no longer has years. The question that remains, the one that no one in Tehran seems able to answer, is not whether Iran's military can survive the next strike. It is whether Iran's system of governance can survive the slow erosion of trust, coherence, and control that has already begun to hollow it out from the inside. Because an army that abandons its own headquarters is not just retreating from a battlefield. It is retreating from the idea that its leadership can protect it. And once that idea takes hold, it spreads faster than any missile can travel through barracks, through cities, through the minds of soldiers who no longer know who they are supposed to follow, or why. The strikes will continue. The evacuations will spread. The leadership will issue statements that sound like control, even as control slips further from their grasp. But the question that will ultimately determine the outcome of this moment is not about what falls from the sky tonight. It is about who remains standing in the morning and whether they still believe in the institutions they are supposed to defend.